This is a video I've been meaning to record for a while, and it's to cover my psychedelic experience. I'm going to cover at the beginning where the circumstances that led me towards it, how the perception of the experience was for me, and everything that I went through during such a short period of time while under the effects of it, and then what it led me towards afterwards. I've got to start at the beginning though, and that's probably 2019. And that's when I separated from my wife. We'd spent a third of our lives together. She's someone I was a carer for. I looked after her health needs, her financial needs. It was a case of I was not only the housekeeper, the breadwinner, and the carer for her, but it was all in effort to build a comfortable lifestyle for the both of us, because at the time she was my font of happiness and where I found peace. Unfortunately, she wasn't faithful to me, and that meant the relationship had to end because it was something I would not stand for. So I suddenly found myself ripped in two, and that's a dramatic statement, but the whole thing was a melodrama in a sense, and it was as it needed to be. It was the right thing at the time, because I think looking back I don't regret this. It's led me to so much more for myself and my own well-being, as someone who put her before myself for the sake of us, and that was the sacrifices I was willing to make at the time. But without needing to do that, my life had changed. I became someone who looked after himself instead. I had been able to take all that energy and effort that I turned towards her and turn it inwards, and that did do me a lot of good. But it was still something I lamented at the time. I had a big radical change on my lifestyle in terms of health, fitness, diet, and the decisions I made for myself. Shortly after this, Lewis, who co-hosts the channel with me, went through a tragedy with his wife, unfortunately. So we both found ourselves as two individuals that were suddenly alone and unpartnered, and trying to make sense of the world again. I can't speak for how he felt at the time and his grief, and I won't try to. But we both came together saying we need a change. We need to try something, and we both had independently come up with the idea of a psychedelic experience. Seems to be on the cusp. We had had discussions together that it was something we both wanted to try, and we hadn't sort of at that level, and it was both right for us at the time. The other thing I want to highlight at this stage before going into the psychedelic experience itself is who I was beforehand. And one of those things was I would describe myself as a misanthrope, someone who had hatred for humanity. I could not love my fellow man, and that's because I had sort of held on to a lot of suffering from childhood and the way I perceived other people based on how I'd been treated, and it really shaped my worldview because of that. And so it was not a comfortable way to live life. I felt very, very sort of hard done by the people around me, and so only had been able to let a certain amount of people into my life, because there were so many that I perceived to only want to harm me. So with one of our other friends, we got together one afternoon, and we went through we had decided sort of ahead of time a day and a time that we get together and we'd do this and see what happened. Did my best to make sure I had the most relaxing environment I had, so I did it here in this lounge at home. I had set everything up the day so it would be as peaceful of an environment as possible. We had created a sort of a music playlist of things that we think could be enjoyable during the experience and might be complementary to it. And other than that, I think I did my best to go in blind. I wanted to have as little presuppositions about what my experience could be like beforehand, so I did no research in terms of what to expect to feel, see, hear, think. I had some loose notions in my head. I was aware of terms, but not what they meant and not what I would sort of undergo myself. So when the time came and we had everything set up, did our best to be nice and relaxed as possible going in. And there was ritual to it. It was a case of I felt like I was enacting a role of a shaman when I sort of set everything up for myself, and made a magic potion. And that's something I've sort of decided is like, that's the way to look at it looking back. I don't know if I quite felt about it that way at the time. But the music went on and I consumed my potion, and it was a case of wait for it to begin. And it was a little scary, not in a terrifying way, but there was an unknown coming. Like if you were to get into a roller coaster's straps and the buckles come down and you're held in place, and it's like, well, there's no turning back now. I'm gonna ride this and see what happens, and it's all for the experience. And that's probably one of the best ways I could describe it. But it was an anticipation. I was positively excited for what could happen and really ready to see where it went. So my friends went and stood outside. They were having a smoke, and I was sort of sat on the sofa. Music was playing, just sort of comfortably waiting, thinking, God, I was a little giddy of, okay, this is going to be an interesting one. And 20 minutes passed, and an album had finished playing and a new album had started, and I was like, well, when's it going to happen? And I sort of looked up at the wall. On the wall, there was a spot of light that had focused from the window. I guess it was slightly refracted because it bent to be able to hit that point on the wall that I was staring at. But the most marvellous thing occurred as it all sort of seemed to kick off at once, and sort of hallucinogen effects began to take place, and I saw the light just sort of break open from a white light into sort of this beautifully refracted rainbow on the wall, that if you probably pointed a camera at it, and if you'd walked in the room sober and looked at it, you probably would have just seen a little blob of white light. But I suddenly burst into hysterics, because for me it was a case of, oh my God, that's all the beauty of what is in light was suddenly spread across the wall. And the other thing that probably put me into that hysterical fit of laughter was this notion that, everything that sort of you see in movies and television and popular media that's supposed to represent this isn't quite right, but kind of gets at it in the sort of psychedelic rainbow effect was hysterically beautiful look at. And so I laid there giggling to myself. And with that, it all really kicked off. And my experience of it was this beautiful imaginal space where light and sound wasn't just something I saw and heard, but I felt with all of my being and really penetrated deep into me and completely filled me, which was absolutely wonderful. It was probably one of the best feelings I could experience, and it made me euphoric at the time. So I closed my eyes, expecting to, I can take a little break from everything I'm seeing in this room and how overwhelming it is in a positive way. But this was very different because in the imaginal space, the mind's eye, where imagery exists in the mind without the eyes, was even more overwhelming than I could have anticipated. I think this is what they call delving, and so I've used that term for it since, because within this space for me, everything was this set of fantastic non-Euclidean geometry. There were these wonderful multicoloured tessellating cubes that would rotate in upon themselves and were all stacked perfectly in every dimension, and an overwhelmingly sort of beautiful sort of visual representation that I would just sit and experience for the next 3 hours whilst focusing on my breathing. And one thing that kept happening was I didn't really notice at the time, and this is only something I've learned about and reflected upon since in other sessions, where I would find myself either holding my breath or exhaling and sitting and letting the visuals occur. And I think this might be something akin to what the Hindus call samadhi, and really just feeling that wonderful stillness until the moment where I would need to take a big deep breath in just to fill myself back up with oxygen. And with that, I'd made the exclamation of the sentence, breathing is important, it keeps our body alive. And I said this dozens of times over the course of the next few hours going through this. It was totally overwhelming. It was nothing that I could ever really put into words. It's that ineffable. I can give you a loose idea by describing it, but words just won't do it justice. There were so many things that I experienced in such a short period of time. Real world time seemed to pass at a very slow rate compared to what I thought had gone on, that's for sure. And I started laying there having conversations, not with the people in the room, maybe with myself, and maybe in response to things I was hearing. And that's not to say I was hearing voices, it was not to say I was hearing words and noises other than the music we were listening to, but I was responding to ideas that were presenting themselves to me. And from where these ideas came, I do not know. And that's because these seem to be ideas that were outside of me, is the best way I can put it. And other people have come to these ideas, it turns out. And this is stuff that I've discovered since. I've got recordings of my first experience and all these things that I've said that I'll go on to in a bit. But the most interesting thing is to hear professionals in the fields trying to get an understanding of this, and what they've recorded other people saying on ideas that they've come to on their experiences. I've watched other videos of people having their first experience out of nowhere, with no influence, saying the same things I said. And I've always found that truly remarkable. So along with breathing is important, another one that I probably must have repeated 20 times at the least, aloud to the people around me, was, we've done this all before. And that came from a feeling of a cyclical loop of feeling like this was an experience I'd already had, and this could be from potentially my lack of short-term memory at the time, and the sort of like the ultimate deja vu feeling on repeat, and that can very well explain it. But it also felt like everything in life and the whole thing is something I had already perceived and I'd forgotten, and I was suddenly remembering, because I came with this great feeling of oneness. And at that point, I had made one single proclamation that I found ludicrous at the time. Being someone, I was atheistic and very much didn't believe in God. I didn't entertain the notion of God. And in the traditional sense of deities in the Christian, Muslim, and other sort of Abrahamic religions' view of the deity, I still don't. And yet at the time I had made the proclamation aloud, I am God. And I was so puzzled with myself having said that at the time, and it's like, what a ludicrous notion, what a ridiculous delusion of grandeur have I just experienced. But it had come from an experience in my imaginal space. If, having my eyes closed, I felt like I had perceived something, and it's what I think people probably mistake for God or a deity of some kind, if they don't mean the Abrahamic notion of God. It almost looked like this luminescent anemone, but colossal in size, floating through space in the void. And my only idea of what I may have perceived would be a representation of the collective consciousness of life, in the thing that we all bud from, all of our consciousnesses stem out of, and what they may all connect back to. So I don't believe this to be a deity, because I don't have such beliefs, but I don't generally have spiritual, religious, or even practical beliefs anymore after this. I'll go into that later. But the good idea of what I was perceiving at the time was, this was almost like a representation of the gestalt of consciousness. And that, I think, was probably the key moment that gave me the feeling of waking up. And suddenly feeling like what was the illusion of life up until that moment was peeled away, and that's what I was left with. And this feeling of what I described at the time in my own words as, I've now seen real reality, was my wording. And for those of you who've never had any kind of experience like this, it sounds so ridiculous, because it's like, well, I see real reality all the time. It's all around me. It's this cup. It's this pen. It's my keys in my pocket, and my face and my skin and me, and that's all real reality. I know it's there because I can see it, and I can hold it, and I can touch it, and I can hit the cup with the pen, and it goes ting. So it must be real. But what I hadn't understood at the time was I had dissolved the idea that that is real. And what I had realised was that everything that my nervous system interacts with, light, sound, heat, is only ever a symbolic representation in my mind. And that what I'm interacting with is reality, sure, but what I see and how I sense it is only ever sort of a model of reality made by my nervous system, and my mind tries its best to bring it all together in a way that I can understand, but it's just a symbolic model, and that's the best way I can describe it in pragmatic terms. So that was like the first 3 hours of this really deep, intense, I'm stuck to the sofa, and as much as possible my eyes are closed because I'm just marvelling at this wonderful beauty of it all, and really just soaking it all in, and just revelling in it. It was euphoric and beautiful. And that's not me trying to just romanticise it. It's honestly probably the most orgasmic long-term feeling I've ever had, and just filled me with such a wonderful peace. And through this, my notions of misanthropy beforehand washed away, and I felt completely purged of these ideas and this notion. And I think that's because I'd suddenly had this understanding of people are also lost in that they're stuck in these perceptions, that their ideas and their notions in their head are what they think is real, because they think that all the sensual stimuli that they have and what their mind does with it is real. So I sort of came with a forgiveness and an understanding that there was no malice for humanity, and there's no malice from humanity towards me, when people could be so lost on what they're perceiving as life. Suddenly what sort of mattered with me and how I'd been treated didn't warrant a grudge anymore, because if they could only see, and that's see in the metaphoric sense, to understand the big picture of how the world as they know it isn't real, it came with this Hanlon's razor at a collective level, and this reignited patience for, they're all stuck on the small picture stuff and they haven't seen the big picture. So that really helped. I felt so much better, and I really let go of these notions I'd held on to so long. And I realised that I couldn't know anything, and that's know with a capital K, not for sure. I could have good ideas, but I've suddenly realised that all of my perception, even if I'd been so sure of something, suddenly it made sense that, that wasn't necessarily real reality all along. So none of it was. So with that, this is I can't know anything for sure, and with that I can't have a belief system, and that's fine. I'm completely comfortable in that. I'd rather have a set of ideas that I think are pretty good ideas, but not be so bound to them that I create my own suffering by holding on to them and fighting with other people's conflicting ideas. it really messed my object permanence. There was, after the 3 hour period, I sort of had the following 3 hours of sitting in the room, still under all the effects, but having a bit more of a lucid perception and trying to work everything out that I'd just been experiencing for 3 hours and trying to make some sense of it and trying to have conversations about it and keep repeating my notions of ideas that I kept coming to. And just feeling like, oh, well, that felt like coming out of a dream, but not just in the psychedelic experience itself was the dream, but my life beforehand was the dream. And so to explain that further, I think the best way is that when I dream whilst I'm asleep, during the dream I'm so certain that I'm not dreaming. Typically, I completely fall into the illusion of it. It feels like its own reality as much as this does right now, in my awake, sober consciousness. And if I do stumble upon the idea that, oh, this is a dream and this isn't real, I think I don't know if it's some sort of mechanism in me that goes, oh, this is a dream, this isn't reality, wake up. And so my dream ends and I normally stop sleeping and I come to and I open my eyes and I feel, yeah, okay, I'm a bit disorientated, but I'm awake in my bed. And it's like, okay, I'm awake in my bed. I must have been dreaming. Yeah, okay. Now imagine that, but that was, you're already awake and yeah, okay, you're not sober. But then you suddenly feel that everything you've experienced in your life up until that moment is itself been a dream. Is to understand that it hasn't been as real as you thought it was. It's just been a imaginal symbol in your mind that's tried to represent reality, but it's no more real than the other dreams. It's maybe based more on reality because it's based on the stimulus of three-dimensional material of reality around you. But it's all just you imagining what it is. So, I'm not solipsistic. I don't think I'm the only consciousness that is alive. But, at the same time, I can't prove that I'm not. So, I've comfortably deal with that existential conflict of I'll give reality the benefit of the doubt and I'll give every other consciousness a benefit of the doubt that it is as real as my consciousness is, relatively. But anything could be a dream. This could still be me in my bed asleep with my eyes closed for all I know. Because I don't think you really can tell the difference deep down. And so I accept that. But I guess the way to word this is it strips all the way down. The whole thing was the Plato's Cave experience of I felt like I'd just left the cave for the first time and I'm going, wow, holy shit, that cave wasn't real. That wasn't the whole thing. That wasn't everything that there is. I look at everything outside the cave. It's a bit of a clumsy metaphor, but the Matrix, in the way that Neo gets disconnected from the Matrix reality, or the Matrix virtual reality for the first time, and that unplugging sensation was very much what I felt at the time. And I had no idea about Plato's Cave, and these kind of metaphors. These are all things I've discovered since. So even to use the Matrix as a metaphor again, I have only learned since that that's the best way to describe it because it sort of fits really well on a metaphoric model. But at the same time, it also did sort of click oh yeah, this is kind of like that. So I definitely had those thoughts whilst I was going through it all. And so these models do work for understanding this. And on the notion of it being trips all the way down, I just want to sort of go on a tangent of I've never had a bad trip with psychedelia in any of my experiences I've had since. But it's made me realise I have had bad trips while I've been completely sober, awake, like this. And that's to say things like having anxiety attacks, doom spirals, really severe depression, and ideas of these false notions in my head about how other people perceive me, what other people think of me, and things like that. I would say that those are just as much of a trip as what you experience when you take psychedelic drugs, when you sleep. It's a false illusion of reality, but in your head it seems so real at the time, and so you have a bad trip with it because you're stumbling around this delusion that things are awful and more awful than they really are, and this is a trick our mind plays on us, and they're truly awful experiences. But again, to reiterate, I've never had a bad experience under the effect of psychedelics, or meditation, anything like that. Other than when I've created my own anxiety attacks, any more than I would from bad mental well-being states. So after I was able to sort of stand up and sort of make sense of things, I sort of had to sit there for a while first before I got to that stage. I had sort of a total amnesia of who I was, and that sounds like that's quite concerning and scary, and I don't want to give people sort of worries with that, because it was comfortable. It was just I didn't recognise my hands or my arms or my organs. I sort of started from the core of like, oh, what am I? What is this? My body, okay. I could feel my gut and my chest, and it was all a new experience to me at the time, and it's interesting to explore and work out, oh, I can move this, and this does these things, and okay, or I can move my legs. So I sort of worked that all out quite quickly. There wasn't any sort of bad disorientation from it. And so one of the things I did is I went up and stood up and I walked outside. I opened my door and I stood out on the step in the sunlight and looked out, and it was a cast over cloudy day. It wasn't particularly warm or bright, but I just looked out at the grass and the trees and the buildings around me, and I just sort of, it's beautiful. It came with a really good feeling to sort of be able to say that, of, oh wow, yeah, I live here and in the world, and this is everything around us, and it's beautiful. It was a really lovely feeling. It was very releasing. The other thing I'd noticed was I would look at my friends. There was a sort of a focus disparity. Their bodies were totally out of focus and blurry, and that didn't matter because faces became incredibly crisp, well-defined and focal. Almost looked like they were floating amongst nothingness in terms of filtering out everything else I was looking at, including their bodies, because their faces became super salient, and I was completely drawn to that. And sort of everything around here was this glorious, like, oh, there you are, you're another being, you're another one of me, you're another part of the collective consciousness that I've just experienced, and am attached with this great oneness that we're all part of. And that oneness does extend to the whole thing, not just other people and other life, but just also this sense of oneness really sort of engulfed everything in reality in third dimensional material space. It was, oh, I am the whole thing. It's all linked to me. We're all part of this great organism. And what I've learned since, in a sense, is that it's correct, because everything you can see, like if you were to look out at a forest in the far distance, and it's just this blur of trees, but it's just as much of you as the rest of you are, in the sense that because you're perceiving it, and we're going back to sort of the mental model of the symbolically representing reality in your own mind, it's as much of a part of the mind as your thoughts and feelings are. So the trees sure are a collection of atoms, of different elements, and they're all organised and structured in certain ways that make them take their form, and that's just buzzing around in the space that we call sort of material reality. But to give it colour, because you're taking the light that's bouncing off of these things and then receiving that into your eyes and passing it through your nervous system, colour is purely an imagined thing. It's not actually real. There's no colour in reality in that sense. It's all within the mind that creates this. So it's as much of the sort of form of thought and feeling as the rest of me is. I probably haven't done justice to explaining that, and I could probably go into this in a much larger way, but I think that's probably the shortest, most concise way I can probably put it for now. And so we sort of spent the rest of the day sort of winding down. I had some food. I felt really, really nauseous, and I had really, really strong headache, to the point of it being almost akin to a migraine. I felt like I'd burnt out, because I'd been running on hot. It felt like I'd overclocked myself for several hours, and so really exhausted myself. It wasn't uncomfortable any more than a hangover is, and this isn't typical apparently for people who have similar things. That's how it affected me. So I needed to make sure I had a day to be comfortable afterwards. So I spent some time sort of talking about it all with my friends and getting comfortable and just winding down after it all. But it left me really good for a few days. Just felt absolutely floating. Like I could deal with everything. My patience factor was phenomenal. I was working in a job where that was a requirement, and suddenly dealing with other people was very easy to do so. Because I suddenly felt like, well, I see things differently now. And that's something I had said to Lewis. I turned to him, and it suddenly, a lot of what he talked about in the past, and his ideas and his notions and the way he worked with certain thoughts that didn't make sense to me, or I was skeptical of, or felt like didn't sort of gel, and I sort of needed to sort of like push forward the idea of, oh no, it's not quite like that. It suddenly all made sense to me a lot more. So I said to him the words, I see the world like you do now. And I still sort of hold a lot truer to that. We align a lot more when we talk about ideas. Not perfectly. We have a lot of disagreement, or we'll sit and talk through trying to fit an idea in and make sense of it together. But the way we can talk is now a lot closer with each other than we could have ever before. And that's been really wonderful. But after it, I felt like I needed to understand what happened still. There was so much sense to still be made. When I go back to sort of like the short-term memory loss and things like that I experienced during it. So that came with like having complete lack of object permanence. So I explained about my hands, but also just walking around my home. If I couldn't see it, it basically didn't exist. And this helped me have a model that broke my previous understanding of it all. By not having access to memory like that, the only things that seemed to exist at the time were the things that I could interact with directly, so things I was looking at. If I walked out the kitchen was just this black void. There was no memory of it. And so it let me realise that, again, I was working off of mental models of objects in objective material reality. But that wasn't actually necessarily what they were. And again, seems like a really loose way to describe it, and I could probably do a better job another time. There's a lot to go through here. But let me understood that it's it all the way down. It's on one level, it's relatively all atoms just floating in the void. These tiny little particles and bits of energy bumping into each other, and not always the way we think it is. In that, if you're not looking at something, there is light bouncing off of it, sure, but it doesn't visually exist in the way that we imagine it. The light's still bouncing off, but if there's nothing to perceive the light, then there's nothing to make that image of it. So that which is not perceived, it doesn't have an image. I think that's the answer to if the tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? There will be vibrations of air particles, for sure, but sound is something we do. Sound is something that is our perception and our nervous system that we make in our mind. An unperceived vibration is not a sound, if that makes sense. That's how I'm interpreting things at the moment, and my sort of the way I've come to sort of terms with it all. But there was the continuing need to understand this all and what I'd experienced and my changed perception of reality. I found people historically who have done their best to do this, like Alan Watts, and I can't recommend Alan Watts more. He's just someone who seemed to really understand it, and so if you've had one of these kind of experiences and want to try and make sense of it, that's probably a good place to go next. And that'll take a long time. You'll have what he says at first might not make as much sense until it all starts to click, but it does eventually all click and it all starts to come into place. And it's all of these thoughts that we're sort of subject to during our first experiences. When you start lining them up with what he's trying to describe and his metaphors, and they all start to click in place, suddenly it all starts to feel a lot more comfortable and like it's a way to understand it that's comforting. The other person I want to talk about at this stage is probably also John Vervaeke. He's someone who's still alive and looking into all this and sort of making it part of his life's work to understand these kind of experiences and what they mean, as well as other kinds of similar experiences and ways to understand reality and how our mind processes it all and interacts with it all in terms of cognitive science. But it was really reassuring when I was going through a lot of his work, and I've probably listened to, if I'm going to be realistic, somewhere around 500 hours of his lectures, interviews, etc., and some of it repeated many times, trying to get a real good grasp on this all. He keeps going back to different ways of understanding this all, and how this kind of spirituality practice in our lives is a really important way to understand the world and brings our lives to have more meaning, when it all makes a lot more sense. It's not all woo. There are practical models that back this up, and the wonderful thing about his works were things that I'd said, like talking about real reality or the really real, the ideas of the representational idea of God for being a model of what we can consider everything, the whole universe, all of life, and this oneness of it all, and the extended consciousness has been very, very comforting to hear a sort of an academic be able to make sense of it in the same way, and to hear my words that came out of nowhere, that weren't fed to me and I didn't learn, suddenly are apparently very common terms. And everything that I explained with sort of the awakening feeling and exiting the matrix feeling, etc., all being very common experiences when this is studied in people having similar experiences and them coming to the same ideas on their own and making sense of it. So do go check out John Vervaeke's work. I really can't recommend that one enough as well. There is a lot to sort of take in with it all, but if you're trying to get to grips with what you've gone through, it's a really good direction to go in. And then, so a few days after the pandemic, spoilers, a few days after the experience, the 2020 pandemic occurred, because my psychedelic experience was at the beginning of March 2020. We had no idea that this was coming at that stage. I was very fortunate enough to be able to get together with some friends before the country was all plunged into lockdown and we weren't allowed to be socially interacting with each other legally, etc. And it set me up quite nicely for going into the pandemic, because I don't think I would have responded as well to the pandemic as I did. And I responded to the pandemic awfully. It was a real rough, rocky, emotional time, and I really needed to be around other people, and suddenly that was forbidden. Literally a matter of days after. But I think I might have struggled more had I not had gone through all of that. I think I might have just plunged into a worse despair than I could have. And what it did give me was a lot of time to sit and listen and study and look up on these ideas that I've talked about. And it sort of changed how I would interact with the world during the pandemic. It let me stand on my own feet a little bit better in terms of holding my own and what I was and wasn't comfortable with and doing and interacting with. What seemed to make sense and what I rejected as nonsense. And it really set me off on a long journey over the next several years. You know, it's been 4 years since. I'd say a lot of my mental work probably came between sort of 2020 and the beginning of 2023, pretty solidly. What that came with was sort of starting to understand myself better, how I function, how my mind works. I've always been sort of quite high in self-awareness and introspection, but it seemed to really amplify those abilities in me. What it helped with is let me open up about it more. Feeling I was able to sort of discuss it all finally with other people. It starts with friends, because they're the people you trust the most, because they're people you chose to let in. And then it went on to being able to talk to my family about things. And this comes with things like, you know, my sexuality and things like that, and other quirks and things that make me feel alienated and separate from other people, which obviously is quite a conflict with trying to feel more at one with everything. But it let me be honest about myself over time, and let me feel less worried about being sort of subject to negative and harsh judgments for such things. So that really helped. And it also just helped me accept that I could be a better person, physically, mentally, behaviourally, and that I was nowhere near done in terms of what I could do to engage in the practices that would allow things to get better every day. And yeah, it really sort of cemented these ideas that I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, and it's been the best way for me to make sense of these things. I think what I like to borrow is the term that I've been taught as a non-N-O-N-E, and that's to say I'm not affiliated with any sort of specific groups. There's definitely some I fall close to. I fall close to Buddhism as an ideology and Hinduism as a religion, because I think they're good models for understanding it, and they're full of good practices that are compatible with all this. What can be found in meditation and trying to find ways to unlock these psychedelic experiences, mode of everyday life, in terms of the oneness feeling, the pleasure in being able to have a widened range of sensual stimuli and take sort of what would be physical senses of sound and light and feeling them more within the core of your mind and experiencing them in a greater way. But I'm absolutely non-Gnostic. I don't believe in deities. I don't think the concept of a deity makes any sense whatsoever. And so that's different from being agnostic, in the sense that agnostic is, to the way it's used now, is to sort of be, oh, I think there might be a God, or I entertain, the entertaining the plausibility of God. The way I see it is, I can't know for sure. I can't know anything for sure, 100%. So I think with the way to line that up with being non-Gnostic is that it sounds like a contradiction and a paradox, but it's like knowing you can't know. But at the same time, it's on that there are no deities seems like very, very certain to me, because it's I think a conflation of an idea, a misunderstanding based on what my participation has been in my experience. So I like to lean on these spiritual collectives, ideologies, like I said. And to hang my hat on them as a phrase. And what hang my hat means is it's a place you call home. It's where you don't wear your hat all the time. You've got to take it off somewhere. If you're going to take it off somewhere, it's probably when you're at home. It's the place where you can put it down when you go to sleep. But also no home is permanent. So just because I might hang my hat on an idea for a while doesn't necessarily mean I'll hold on to it forever, and I'm happy to move away from it if I sort of encounter new ideas that sort of seem to take me towards something better that makes more sense. So that's led me to sort of really double down on my physical health as well, because suddenly, even though I was already looking after myself, it all seems like so much more important to become the best version of myself that I can in this lifetime, and it's given me a real drive for that. And I lost a massive amount of weight, I gained a massive amount of fitness and stamina. Subsequent sort of trips over the course of the following years caused me to change my career. Suddenly, a corporate career, spending several hours a day, several days a week in a metal box, seemed to not make sense to me anymore, and it was no good for me. And so now I run my own business, and I do something where I'm out in the fresh air all day and experiencing nature, because I felt that became a really sort of salient need in my life. And various other changes that came in sort of subsequent trips that just allowed me to be closer to what I think is a better form of lifestyle than I'd ever had before. And for that, I'm really appreciative that I've gone through all this to do that. My relationship with family is good. My relationship with all my friends is good. But the most important thing, I think, is like, I didn't have a relationship with wisdom before. It seemed important to talk about ideas and stuff, but it's sort of become my understanding, like, oh, it's so vital to fill my life with wisdom and meaning that that's the true path forward. And the best way to be present. It's led me to really good lifestyle changes in every way, a new functional, healthy relationship that's better than anything I've ever had before. I found love again and was able to find someone who is emotionally, intellectually and physically my equal. And so there's not this sort of debilitating, unhealthy, codependent relationship of I was emotionally dependent on someone else and they were physically dependent on me. Now I've got something where we both look after each other's needs equally in wonderful ways, and that's been absolutely fantastic. It's really sort of, I didn't have a bad life before, but it's led me to find that I can have so much more. And so it's not like I needed to turn my life around, but I did. And it's been brilliant. There's been so many terms I've had to come to understand all this and make sense of this and make sense of my life much more better than I ever could. But it's really taken me to some wonderful places and will continue to do so. I've got so much more to do, so much more to learn and grow on, and I'm looking forward to all of that. So I think my takeaway from this is this has never been a bad thing for me in any way. And if you've not experienced anything like this before and you're considering it, make sure you're with people you love and trust, and you treat these things with the respect they deserve, and take the cautions you need to without creating a fear for yourself, because you don't want to go into these experiences nervous, anxious and fearful, because you're going to bring some bad feelings with you. You want to go in peaceful, happy and safe, and you'll only feel that sort of continued good build up from it. But we shouldn't be treating these things like they're toys to be played with. We should be treating them like tools that need reverence. And if you have had an experience before and any of this has lined up with you and has helped make sense of some things you haven't quite worked out, or some of the things that I've said have given you leads to go and make sense of something later, or go and find someone who's talking about this kind of stuff and listening to sort of what their experiences were and all the things they've done to work out and make sense of it and understand it since. Happy for that. That's probably the best way to sort of get the most value out of these experiences. I think the ultimate end line to this is that it's let me understand the relatively realness to reality, and that's been the biggest change in perception.